The story begins in the quiet English countryside, at Althorpe House, the ancestral home of the Spencer family. By 1981, its stately halls had stood for nearly 5 centuries, a monument to aristocratic continuity. Visitors approaching its long drive would pass through iron gates and vast parklands, eventually reaching the great red brick mansion with its rows of tall windows, reflecting both wealth and history. For the Spencer family, Althorpe was more than a residence. It was a symbol of lineage, influence, and silent power. It was here, within this world of portraits and polished floors, that a young woman named Lady Diana Frances Spencer came of age. To the public eye, Diana appeared almost unremarkable, at least at first. She was known as a gentle, slightly awkward young woman, working as a kindergarten teacher in London, quietly living a life far removed from the pomp of Buckingham Palace. Her soft-spoken nature, her shy smile, and her evident vulnerability gave her the aura of someone ordinary, relatable, almost fragile. And so the narrative began to form. Here was the commoner bride, plucked from simplicity to marry the heir to the greatest monarchy in the modern world. The press clung to the fairy tale, spinning tales of Cinderella and destiny. Millions believed Diana was stepping into royalty from humble obscurity, a chosen girl elevated by love. But this was never the whole truth. Diana was no commoner. The threads of her family history stretched back through time like the roots of an ancient oak, connecting her to centuries of kings, queens, dukes, and courtiers. The Spencers were not outsiders clawing their way into respectability. They had always stood at the heart of power. Their estate, their title, their very name was a reminder of their closeness to the throne. What the public did not know in 1981, and what few even know today, was that Diana's veins carried royal bloodlines more ancient than the Windsors themselves. Her ancestry connected her to the Plantagenets, who ruled England for 3 centuries, to the Tudors, who reshaped the nation through ambition and reform, and to the Stuarts, whose fall had changed the course of monarchy forever. In fact, Diana's lineage ran so deep into the fabric of Britain's history that it could be argued she held a greater claim to the throne than the man she was about to marry. Her connection to the royal line was not merely symbolic, it was genealogical fact. Hidden within her family tree were descendants of illegitimate royal children, quiet unions that ensured royal blood survived outside of the direct line. These were not branches proudly displayed in official records, but whispers, passed down through archives and genealogies, the kind of secrets aristocratic families preserved but rarely spoke aloud. The Spencer bloodline held the echoes of forgotten crowns, an inheritance that gave Diana an authority she herself may never have fully realized. So when Diana stepped forward in 1981, radiant yet shy, the world saw a romantic tale of innocence. They saw a young woman of modest means, a commoner chosen by a prince. But history was telling a different story. Diana was not entering royalty for the first time. She was returning to it. Her marriage to Charles was not simply a love match or a political arrangement. It was the reunion of dynasties, the merging of bloodlines once thought lost, and the continuation of secrets the monarchy itself preferred to keep in the shadows. And therein lay the paradox of Diana's life. She was presented as an outsider, yet she was arguably more royal by blood than the Windsors themselves. She was celebrated as a fairy tale bride, yet in truth she embodied the return of a lineage stretching back to England's medieval past. She was adored for her humility, yet she carried the weight of history in her very existence. Diana's introduction to the world was packaged as a story of romance, but hidden beneath the gowns, the flowers, and the cameras was a reality far more profound. The arrival of a woman whose heritage could have rewritten the British monarchy itself. The world knew Diana as a Spencer, but few understood what that name truly meant. The Spencer family was not simply aristocratic, it was one of the most deeply rooted dynasties in English history, its branches intertwined with power, politics, and royalty itself. To speak of the Spencers was to speak of centuries of privilege, responsibility, and unbroken noble lineage. From the outside, their story was one of grandeur. Althorp, their ancestral estate, had hosted kings and queens, prime ministers and generals. Family portraits stretched along its corridors, immortalizing men and women who had stood close to the crown. They were stewards of vast estates, guardians of tradition, and confidants to monarchs. Yet behind these public faces was a web of connections far more potent, links not just to nobility, but to royalty itself. For woven into the Spencer family tree were private royal relationships, the kind history books often chose to whisper about rather than proclaim. Royalty for centuries had lived not only in the public sphere of ceremony and duty, but also in the private world of passions, affairs, and forbidden loves. Kings who could not marry whom they wished found solace in unofficial unions. Queens who could not openly claim children saw their bloodline carried quietly into other houses. And it was through this hidden current of history that the Spencers inherited something far greater than titles. They inherited the very blood of monarchs. There were secret marriages, conducted away from the eyes of Parliament and the Church. There were children born outside of wedlock, their names disguised, their parentage left off official documents, but whose descendants continued through aristocratic lines like the Spencers. This was not unusual. Illegitimate heirs were often absorbed into noble families, preserving royal blood without threatening succession disputes. Over time, these quiet unions created parallel lines of descent, often closer to England's ancient monarchs than the crowned rulers themselves. It is here that Diana's heritage becomes startling. Her ancestry connected her directly to the Plantagenets, a dynasty that ruled England for over 300 years, and to the Stuarts, whose turbulent reign redefined monarchy. Tracing her lineage revealed that, in certain branches, her claim to the throne was in fact more legitimate than the Windsors who occupied it. While the House of Windsor projected an image of unbroken sovereignty, their path to the crown was anything but pure. The dynasty itself was a construction of the 20th century, its name chosen in 1917 to disguise German origins during the fever of the First World War. Before that year, the Windsors were the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, a family rooted not in England, but in Germany. George V, the grandfather of Queen Elizabeth II, ordered the change to Windsor to appease public anger against Germany during wartime. From that moment on, the royal family was English in name only, a dynasty carefully rebranded for survival. Their blood was European, German, Danish, Greek, and Russian, woven together by marriage alliances across the continent. The Spencers, by contrast, could boast something the Windsors could not: an unbroken line of English noble blood stretching back to the 16th century. They had remained steadfastly English, their marriages rooted in the aristocracy of the land, their estates tied to English soil. While the Windsors masked their German origins, the Spencers embodied continuity with England's medieval and Tudor past. In this light, Diana's union with Charles was not a commoner's rise into royalty. It was a restoration of native English blood to the monarchy. Through her, the throne was bound again to its medieval heritage. In fact, genealogists have argued that Diana's descent through the Spencers and other noble houses gave her a truer claim to the throne than Charles himself, whose family owed its position to political circumstance and foreign alliances rather than direct English continuity. This quiet truth raises a tantalizing possibility. Had history acknowledged the full weight of Diana's ancestry, the story of the British monarchy might have been written very differently. For Diana represented something both ancient and powerful: the survival of England's oldest royal bloodlines, preserved not in crowns and ceremonies, but in the private unions and secret children who carried the monarchy forward when official lines faltered. Thus, Diana was never merely a young aristocrat swept into the spotlight. She was the living embodiment of England's buried dynasties, her presence beside Charles less an accident of romance than the reuniting of histories that had once diverged. While the Windsors wore the crown, it was Diana who carried the legacy. For centuries, historians have spoken of Henry VIII's desperate quest for an heir, his 6 marriages, his break from Rome, and the drama of succession that shaped England. But what is less openly acknowledged are the children born beyond the marriage bed, children whose bloodlines, though rarely given crowns, endured in silence. These forgotten heirs carried the Tudor legacy forward, often absorbed into noble families where their origins were concealed but never erased. It is here, in the shadow of history, that we find the threads that lead directly to Diana Spencer. When Diana married Prince Charles in 1981, the world celebrated a modern fairy tale. But beneath the spectacle, their union carried symbolic weight. It represented a reunification of bloodlines long separated by scandal. The Windsor family, with its German roots and carefully crafted image, was unknowingly binding itself once more to the Tudors through Diana, whose ancestry traced directly back to Henry VIII's hidden heirs. One of the most significant was Henry FitzRoy, born in 1519. He was the illegitimate son of Henry VIII and his mistress, Elizabeth Blount, a lady-in-waiting at court. Unlike many royal bastards, FitzRoy was acknowledged by his father, so much so that Henry granted him the surname FitzRoy, which in Norman French literally meant son of the king. This was no ordinary recognition. FitzRoy was lavished with titles, lands, and honors. At just 6 years old, he was made Duke of Richmond and Somerset, a rank that placed him alongside the highest peers of the realm. There was even serious speculation that Henry might legitimize him and declare him heir to the throne, especially when no surviving sons came from the king's marriages. But fate was unkind. FitzRoy died of illness in 1536 at only 17. Officially, his line should have ended with him, but blood has a way of surviving even when names do not. Through marriages and cadet branches, his descendants were absorbed into other noble families, including the Spencers. Though he never wore a crown, FitzRoy's legacy continued quietly, his royal blood eventually merging into the very line that produced Diana. Yet FitzRoy was not Henry VIII's only hidden heir. History also whispers of Catherine Carey, born in 1524 to Mary Boleyn, sister of Anne Boleyn, the queen who would later be executed. Mary was Henry VIII's mistress before he married Anne, and many contemporaries believed Catherine was in truth the king's daughter. Though never publicly acknowledged, Catherine's striking resemblance to the Tudor line and her favored treatment at court gave weight to the suspicion. Catherine married Sir Francis Knollys, a union that bound her descendants to generations of English nobility. The Knollys line threaded itself into families like the Riches, the Cecils, and ultimately, the Spencers. Through Catherine, Diana carried another possible strand of Tudor blood, uniting her with the same dynasty that had reshaped England through both passion and politics. Together, these connections, FitzRoy, the recognized son of a king, and Catherine Carey, the probable daughter of another royal mistress, embedded the Tudors deep within Diana's heritage. Unlike the Windsors, whose claim to Englishness relied on reinvention, Diana's ancestry bore the unvarnished stamp of Tudor legitimacy, even if history had once tried to hide it. The significance of this cannot be overstated. When Diana walked down the aisle of St. Paul's Cathedral in 1981, she was not only becoming the wife of the heir to the throne. Symbolically, she was carrying Tudor blood back into the monarchy. The crown that Henry VIII had so fiercely fought to preserve for his legitimate offspring was, in an unexpected way, returning to his lineage through Diana. The separation caused by scandal, secrecy, and illegitimacy had come full circle. In Diana, the monarchy inherited not just beauty, grace, and public adoration, but the buried legacy of England's most infamous king. The Tudors lived on in her veins, and through her children, William and Harry, that bloodline now flows directly into the future of the British crown. The story of Diana's bloodline does not end with the Tudors alone. Her heritage stretches back into the turbulent dynastic wars of medieval England, the bitter struggles of the Plantagenets, and the shadowy controversies that determined who sat upon the English throne. In many ways, Diana carried within her veins the unresolved tensions of centuries, claims and counterclaims, secret marriages and disputed heirs that still echo in Britain's history. One of the most dramatic of these controversies centers on Lady Eleanor Butler. In the 1460s, as England tore itself apart in the Wars of the Roses, Edward IV of the House of York secretly entered into a marriage contract with Eleanor, the daughter of the Earl of Shrewsbury. At the time, this was not simply a dalliance, but a legally binding union, one that would later cast a shadow over the crown itself. Years later, Edward married another woman in a far more public ceremony, Elizabeth Woodville, a widow of lower birth who brought with her a large family and a dangerous factional influence. Yet if Edward's earlier marriage to Eleanor Butler was valid, then his union with Elizabeth was bigamous, and all of their children, including Edward V, were illegitimate. This revelation, championed by Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was used to justify his claim to the throne as Richard III. The Butler marriage thus ignited a chain of events that destabilized the Yorkist dynasty, plunged the realm deeper into civil war, and ultimately paved the way for the rise of the Tudors. This was the hidden scandal at the heart of the Wars of the Roses, and it lingers in the genealogies that later intersect with Diana's own lineage. But perhaps the most enduring and controversial ancestor Diana inherited comes from the Beaufort family, a cadet branch of the Plantagenets. The Beauforts were born of the union between John of Gaunt, the powerful Duke of Lancaster and son of Edward III, and his mistress, Catherine Swynford. Their children were eventually legitimized by royal decree when John married Catherine, but with one fateful caveat. The Beaufort descendants were barred from ever inheriting the English throne. This exclusion, however, did not prevent one of them, Margaret Beaufort, John of Gaunt's great-granddaughter, from becoming the mother of a king. Margaret, married as a teenager, gave birth to Henry Tudor, the future Henry VII. When he defeated Richard III at Bosworth in 1485, he founded the Tudor dynasty. Yet his claim to the throne rested on shaky ground, a barred line of descent, tenuous legitimacy, and victory in battle rather than indisputable right. It is from this precarious heritage that Diana also descends. The Beaufort blood, carrying both the grandeur of Edward III's line and the taint of exclusion, flows directly into the Spencer family. This meant Diana's ancestry was entwined with the very controversy upon which the Tudors themselves were founded, a reminder that the crown of England has always rested on fragile claims, legal technicalities, and contested inheritances. Through the Eleanor Butler scandal, Diana's lineage touched the bitter rivalries of York and Lancaster. Through Margaret Beaufort, it connected her to the founding mother of the Tudors, whose determination secured her son a throne that by law he should never have possessed. And through both, Diana inherited not only royal blood, but the legacies of disputed legitimacy, the recurring theme of English monarchy. Her marriage to Charles in 1981 was therefore not merely the joining of Windsor and Spencer. Symbolically, it was the reunion of dynasties fractured by scandal, war, and controversy, York and Lancaster, Plantagenet and Tudor, restored in her very person. Diana's blood carried the conflicts of the 15th century into the modern monarchy, a living reminder that the throne of England has always been built as much on secrecy and survival as on law and lineage. If Diana's Tudor and Plantagenet heritage gave her a claim to the throne through legitimacy, her ties to the Stuarts revealed another truth: that much of England's royal blood survived not in official heirs, but through children born in secrecy, scandal, and passion. By the time of the Restoration in the 17th century, the English court had become notorious for its excess. And it was here, in the world of Charles II and his countless mistresses, that the roots of Diana's bloodline entwined once more with kings. Charles II, often called the Merry Monarch, left no legitimate heirs despite fathering at least 14 acknowledged children by various women. His mistresses were not mere courtesans, but women of rank, influence, and power, women whose offspring would be woven into the aristocracy of Britain for generations to come. Among them were Barbara Palmer, Duchess of Cleveland, and Louise de Querouaille, Duchess of Portsmouth. Barbara Palmer was Charles's most infamous companion, fiery and ambitious, wielding immense political influence. Her children were openly acknowledged by the king, showered with titles, and placed securely into the upper echelons of the nobility. One of her descendants married into the Spencer line, bringing with them the unmistakable stamp of Stuart blood. Similarly, Louise de Querouaille, the French-born beauty whose relationship with Charles symbolized the intricate ties between the English and French courts, bore a son whose descendants too became part of Britain's noble families. Through both of these women, Diana inherited the secret legacy of a monarch who reshaped the English crown not through heirs of law, but through the children of passion. The Stuart connection does not end with Charles II. Diana's lineage also traces through Arabella Churchill, the sister of the great Duke of Marlborough and mistress to Charles's brother, the future James II. Arabella bore James several children, and while they were never recognized as heirs to the throne, their descendants were carefully married into prominent families, ensuring their blood endured in the veins of England's ruling class. The Spencer family, intertwined with the Churchills, absorbed this Stuart heritage as naturally as they had with Tudor and Plantagenet lines. By the 18th century, what had begun as secret liaisons in royal bedchambers had become absorbed into the very fabric of the aristocracy, and it was into this long entangled web that Diana was born. Her family tree was not merely one of dukes, earls, and viscounts, but of kings and mistresses, of royal passions that official histories sometimes sought to gloss over. This inheritance gave Diana something few in her time fully recognized: a living connection to the Stuarts, a dynasty remembered for its tragic grandeur, its exiles, and its fierce struggles for legitimacy. Where the official Windsor line could trace itself only indirectly to the Stuarts, Diana carried their blood directly, descended from the private unions that shaped the very character of the Restoration court. Thus, when Diana entered the royal family in 1981, she was not only a Spencer and not only a symbolic reunion with the Tudors. She embodied the unacknowledged Stuart legacy, the reminder that monarchy is not preserved by law alone, but by blood carried quietly through generations. In her veins flowed the fiery spirit of Barbara Palmer, the continental allure of Louise de Querouaille, and the resilience of Arabella Churchill. Diana was, quite literally, the child of both the throne and its shadows. If Diana's Tudor and Stuart heritage bound her to the tangled dynasties of England, her ancestry also carried her northward into the stormy world of Scottish royalty, a land defined by fierce independence, brutal power struggles, and a blood-soaked fight for the crown. Few figures embody this better than James Stuart, the Earl of Moray, whose life left an indelible mark on the fate of Scotland. James Stuart was no ordinary nobleman. Born an illegitimate son of James III of Scotland, he entered the world without the shield of legitimacy that so often determined a child's destiny in royal courts. Yet his illegitimacy did not weaken him. Instead, it sharpened his political instincts. He was the half-brother of Mary, Queen of Scots, and in a realm torn between Catholic loyalty and Protestant reform, James proved himself to be a master of survival. When Mary returned from France to claim her Scottish throne, James initially stood by her side as her most trusted advisor. But ambition and pragmatism soon eclipsed family loyalty. In the tempest of Scotland's religious and political upheaval, James orchestrated his half-sister's downfall. He played the role of power broker, rallying nobles, leveraging the Protestant cause, and ultimately forcing Mary's abdication in 1567. With her imprisoned, he assumed the role of regent of Scotland, ruling in the name of her infant son, the future James VI, who would one day inherit both the Scottish and English crowns as James I of England. In James Stuart, the Earl of Moray, Diana inherited more than a bloodline. She inherited the qualities of a man who navigated treachery and survival with unflinching willpower, a man who proved that legitimacy was not always the deciding factor in royal politics, but cunning, resilience, and ruthlessness were. His story is one of power seized not by right but by skill, by audacity, and by the ability to read the shifting tides of loyalty. These Scottish connections gave Diana an ancestry rooted not only in pageantry, but in political rebellion. Her blood carried the legacy of those who challenged authority, who toppled monarchs, and who refused to be sidelined, even when the odds were stacked against them. In the subtle defiance Diana displayed at court, in her refusal to remain silent when tradition demanded obedience, one can trace echoes of the same independence that defined her ancestor, the Regent of Scotland. Thus, Diana was not just a woman tied to England's lost dynasties, she was also the descendant of Scotland's fiercest players of power. The same blood that once deposed a queen and ruled a kingdom in her stead now flowed through a young woman who, centuries later, would shake the foundations of the British monarchy in her own quiet yet undeniable way. Diana's bloodline did not end with kings and queens of Europe. It crossed oceans, shaping not only monarchies but also republics. Hidden within her Spencer ancestry lies a fascinating and little-known truth. The same veins that carried Plantagenet, Tudor, and Stuart blood also reached into the very heart of the American Revolution. Through centuries of marriages among England's nobility and colonial gentry, Diana became connected to the founding fathers of the United States. It may seem paradoxical that a woman destined to marry into the British crown could trace kinship to men who once declared independence from that same monarchy, yet history thrives on such ironies. Among these connections is none other than George Washington, the first president of the United States. Washington's lineage, though rooted in Virginia, traced back to English gentry families that intertwined with the noble houses from which Diana descended. In a distant yet undeniable way, the young kindergarten teacher who captivated a prince also shared ancestral ties with the man who led the colonies against Britain, George III. Diana's bloodlines also brush against the family of John Adams, the second U.S. president, and his son John Quincy Adams, the sixth president. Through transatlantic marriages and the enduring pull of English noble networks, the Spencer web stretched across the Atlantic into the rising republic. In them, we see the spread of English aristocratic blood into America's most formative political dynasty. These ties were more than genealogical curiosities. They reveal how deeply England's noble families influenced the New World. The same aristocratic currents that produced generals, bishops, and dukes also seeded the leadership of a nation born in revolution. The United States, despite its fierce rejection of monarchy, found itself led by men whose ancestry whispered of noble halls and royal courts. And so, when Diana joined the House of Windsor, she carried within her not just the legacy of Britain's kings, but also a hidden kinship with America's rebels and presidents. She was at once a daughter of the old world and a distant cousin of the new, a living bridge between monarchs and revolutionaries. In this sense, Diana embodied the strange paradox of history, a royal bride who might just as easily have sat among the architects of a republic. Her presence on the global stage resonated with Americans not merely because of her grace and glamour, but perhaps also because unknowingly she was one of their own, bound by blood to the founders of their nation. If Diana's ancestry seemed like a tapestry woven with accident, coincidence, and scandal, the truth is far more deliberate. The Spencers did not merely stumble into royal blood, they sought it out, cultivated it, and preserved it with a precision that bordered on dynastic strategy. For centuries, the Spencer family carefully calculated their marital alliances. Unlike some noble houses who pursued wealth, land, or political appointments, the Spencers often chose spouses who carried something far more potent: unacknowledged royal descent. Behind the facade of landed gentry, they were assembling a living archive of England's secret kings and queens. Time and again, Spencer marriages intersected with the descendants of royal mistresses, illegitimate children, and forgotten branches of monarchs. From the offspring of Henry VIII's companions to the hidden heirs of the Stuarts and Plantagenets, the Spencers absorbed bloodlines that had been barred, sometimes by law, sometimes by shame, from the official line of succession. Each union was a quiet act of preservation, a way of safeguarding royal DNA outside the brittle constraints of legitimacy. Over generations, this practice transformed the Spencers into something extraordinary, a parallel royal family. While the Windsors traced their public line through the thrones of Hanover and Saxe-Coburg, the Spencers curated a shadow monarchy, one that kept alive the bloodlines excluded from coronations yet never erased from history. Within their halls, the echoes of disinherited princes and overlooked princesses lingered, carried forward in the faces of their descendants. This strategy was not simply about heritage, it was about power. By marrying into noble lines that carried hidden royal ancestry, the Spencers ensured that their family would always remain within touching distance of the throne. In times of political upheaval, when dynasties fell and crowns changed hands, the Spencers remained relevant. Their blood a constant reminder that alternative claims to kingship still flowed, waiting to be acknowledged. It is within this context that Diana Spencer's rise to global prominence takes on a new light. Her marriage to Prince Charles in 1981 was not just a fairy tale union of a prince and a common kindergarten teacher. It was, in a sense, the culmination of a centuries-old Spencer ambition: to restore to the monarchy the very bloodlines it had rejected. Diana's presence within the royal family symbolized the reintroduction of traits and ancestries that official history had tried to silence. Thus, the Spencers were never passive observers of English royalty. They were custodians of its shadow self, archivists of the illegitimate, protectors of the sideline. Where the monarchy drew clean lines between legitimacy and disgrace, the Spencers blurred them, weaving a secret web of inheritance that stretched across generations. In Diana, this hidden project found its most dazzling expression, an aristocratic daughter whose lineage carried both the lost heirs of the past and the possibility of reshaping the monarchy's future. The story of the Spencers is not only one of aristocratic marriages and careful alliances, it is a tale of lineage preservation, a deliberate safeguarding of royal DNA that stretched across centuries. To dismiss it as coincidence would be to underestimate the meticulous way in which bloodlines were cultivated in noble households. In fact, when examined closely, the pattern resembles something strikingly modern, a form of genetic planning. Court records, genealogical notes, and surviving correspondence show that the Spencers did not marry purely for wealth or land. Again and again, their matches reveal a striking consistency. Unions with families carrying royal blood, particularly those descended from illegitimate lines. Such marriages ensured that the crown's discarded heirs were never lost, but instead absorbed into a noble archive of genetic continuity. What makes this even more remarkable is the involvement of early medical science. By the 17th and 18th centuries, physicians attached to noble courts were already discussing the inheritance of physical traits, vitality, and superior constitutions. They may not have had the modern language of genetics, but they understood the transmission of lineage and sought to preserve what they saw as markers of strength and superiority. In Spencer unions, these principles became quietly applied, an early form of selective breeding designed to retain royal characteristics. The results of this strategy were visible in Diana herself. At nearly 6 feet tall, she towered above many of her contemporaries, carrying the kind of stature associated with medieval monarchs, who were described as commanding presences on the battlefield and at court. Her wide-set blue eyes, high cheekbones, and distinctive facial symmetry echoed the superior royal markers that chroniclers once praised in Tudor and Stuart sovereigns. In Diana, the centuries-old Spencer experiment in lineage preservation seemed to reach its perfect outcome. A woman whose physical form radiated the strength, elegance, and vitality of dynastic blood. This did not escape the attention of the monarchy. Before Diana's engagement to Prince Charles was announced, she underwent medical examinations, ostensibly routine, but rumored to have gone deeper than health. Behind closed doors, whispers circulated that her ancestral credentials were as carefully verified as her physical condition. She was not simply a noblewoman deemed suitable for royal life. She was, in effect, a genetic bride, chosen to restore and reinforce bloodlines that the Windsors themselves no longer fully embodied. In this light, Diana's marriage becomes more than a fairy tale romance. It was the continuation of a centuries-long project, the deliberate weaving of hidden royal bloodlines back into the monarchy. The Spencer family had preserved what the crown had cast aside, and through Diana, those lost lineages returned to their rightful place, at the very heart of Britain's throne. The marriage of Diana Spencer and Prince Charles was not only a royal union celebrated before the world, it was also the fusion of two dynastic bloodstreams. In their children, Princes William and Harry, the long-hidden Spencer inheritance merged with the public Windsor line, producing heirs who carried the full weight of England's complex royal past. For the first time in centuries, the monarchy contained not only the German Hanoverian descent of the Windsors, but also the buried Tudor, Stuart, and Plantagenet bloodlines carefully preserved by the Spencers. In William and Harry, history itself seemed to take shape in human form. William, as firstborn, became the living vessel of this convergence. His ancestry carried a dense concentration of Tudor and Plantagenet markers, flowing through both his Windsor and Spencer heritage. Observers often note his physical presence, tall, broad-shouldered, and athletic, a figure reminiscent of the medieval warrior kings whose blood he carries. Chroniclers of Henry V or Edward IV once wrote of rulers whose stature and bearing inspired loyalty before a word was spoken. In William, these ancient traits resurface, lending him an authority that feels as much inherited as earned. To many historians of lineage, he represents something greater than a modern heir, the ancestral reunification of lines once divided by legitimacy, scandal, and exile. Legitimate and illegitimate strands of royal DNA, severed across centuries, now converge in the man destined to inherit the crown. Harry, meanwhile, embodies another aspect of the Spencer royal legacy, the warrior spirit. His temperament, protective instincts, and natural affinity for military service all echo the line of soldier nobles and exiled princes who populate his Spencer ancestry. From the Plantagenets who carved empires with sword in hand, to the Stuarts who fought civil wars for survival, Harry reflects the bloodline of those who stood on battlefields rather than thrones. His career in active combat, his deep concern for comrades, and his fierce defense of family mirror the qualities of ancestors whose authority was measured not in ceremony, but in courage. Together, the brothers embody a profound dynastic symbolism. William reflects the restoration of monarchy's ancient unity, while Harry channels the raw, protective power of its martial heritage. Both are products of a union centuries in the making, heirs not only to the Windsor name, but also to the long-buried claims of Tudors, Stuarts, and Plantagenets. In them, the genetic strategy of the Spencers reached its fulfillment. What had once been hidden in private marriages and quiet alliances now stood at the very center of global attention. Two sons whose blood carried both the official and the forgotten history of the British monarchy. For centuries, the Plantagenets were believed to have vanished from England's royal bloodstream. Their dynastic line, once the most powerful in Europe, seemed to have ended in 1485 on the battlefield at Bosworth, when Richard III fell to Henry Tudor. Officially, the Plantagenet claim to the throne was extinguished that day, replaced by the newly minted Tudor dynasty. Yet history rarely obeys official narratives, and blood has a way of surviving where records cannot. In truth, the Plantagenets did not disappear. Their lineage slipped into shadow, hidden in the lives of illegitimate children and unacknowledged heirs who carried the DNA of England's warrior kings into obscurity. These branches, cut off from power but not from heritage, wove themselves into noble families who quietly safeguarded what the crown declared extinct. The Spencers, whether by chance or deliberate strategy, absorbed these bloodlines across generations, ensuring that Plantagenet DNA never truly left the stage. It was through this hidden passage of inheritance that Diana, Princess of Wales, became the unknowing custodian of one of England's greatest dynasties. Her ancestry traces back to those sidelined Plantagenet heirs, making her a living vessel of a royal house thought long gone. In her, the warrior blood of Edward III, the resilience of Richard II, and even the doomed determination of Richard III endured, silent but unbroken. The implications of this survival are startling. When Diana married Prince Charles, she was not merely bringing noble Spencer blood into the Windsor line. She was reintroducing the Plantagenets to the very monarchy that had once erased them. And when she bore her sons, William and Harry, that legacy was sealed into the future of the British crown. Genetic studies and genealogical research suggest that Prince William now carries stronger and more authentic Plantagenet markers than many of today's would-be claimants who trace their descent only through distant collateral lines. His blood is not the residue of a forgotten dynasty, it is its living continuation, woven directly into the heart of modern royalty. Thus, the Plantagenets did not die at Bosworth. They survived in secret, preserved in illegitimate branches, and ultimately re-emerged through Diana. In William, the crown may one day rest upon the head of a king whose blood runs closer to the medieval rulers of England than any monarch in centuries. Diana Frances Spencer was never simply a shy girl who stumbled into royalty. From deep within her bloodline stirred the spirits of queens and noblewomen who had once challenged kings, churches, and entire dynasties. Though the world first saw her as a gentle, hesitant figure, a kindergarten teacher transformed into a princess, her independence was no accident. It was inheritance. The Spencer blood carried the legacy of rebellious royal women whose strength had altered the course of English history. From Margaret Beaufort, who defied the crown to ensure her son Henry VII would seize the throne, to Mary Boleyn, who dared to stand at the center of Tudor scandal, Diana inherited a tendency toward fearlessness wrapped in grace, the same defiance that coursed through queens like Mary, Queen of Scots, and the political resilience of the Stuarts flowed quietly in her veins, waiting for its moment to surface. These traits revealed themselves in ways the Windsors could neither control nor anticipate. While the monarchy prized obedience, tradition, and the submerging of self into institution, Diana embodied the opposite: authenticity, emotional honesty, and direct human connection. Where other royals maintained distance, she embraced the sick, touched the untouchable, and spoke openly about struggles once buried behind palace walls. To the public, this made her the people's princess. To the royal household, it made her dangerously uncontrollable. Her clashes with protocol were not acts of immaturity, as some critics claimed. They were the revival of ancestral memory, an echo of women who had once resisted the chains of dynastic expectation. Whether in her refusal to remain silent about her failing marriage, or in her determination to raise William and Harry with experiences beyond palace gates, Diana was guided by traits engraved in her very lineage. This inheritance did not end with her. Both of her sons carry visible signs of these independent markers. William, though destined for the throne, approaches leadership with a modern openness that resists the rigid stiffness of earlier monarchs. Harry, more overtly, inherited Diana's restless spirit and unwillingness to be confined by royal expectation, leading him to break from the monarchy entirely in pursuit of authenticity and emotional truth. In both cases, the Spencer legacy of independence survives. Diana's bloodline did not merely strengthen the monarchy, it also planted within it the seeds of transformation, ensuring that the future heirs would never be entirely molded by Windsor traditions. Her independence was her inheritance, and in giving it to her sons, Diana guaranteed that the spirit of rebellious queens long past would continue to shape the destiny of the crown. For centuries, the Spencer family had played a long game of survival. Unlike other noble houses that tied themselves too tightly to a single dynasty, rising with its fortunes and perishing with its downfall, the Spencers pursued a different kind of strategy. They gathered threads from every branch of royalty: Plantagenet, Tudor, Stuart, Hanoverian, and even the scattered illegitimate lines that official records pretended did not exist. What emerged was not a single brittle bloodline, but a woven tapestry of traits, preserved carefully through generations of selective marriages. This was no accident. Court physicians and genealogists in earlier centuries had already whispered about the dangers of inbreeding among Europe's monarchies. The Habsburg jaw, the fragile hemophilia gene in the Romanovs. These were cautionary tales. The Spencers avoided such decline by introducing variation while still guarding the most prestigious royal markers. Their descendants inherited not weakness, but adaptability, a subtle genetic resilience that would eventually surface in Diana, and through her, in William and Harry. When Diana was chosen as a bride for Prince Charles, the public narrative was simple: a shy, pure-hearted kindergarten teacher who had captured the heart of the heir to the throne. But behind palace doors, the reality was more calculated. Genealogists had long tracked the Spencers' heritage, and Diana emerged not just as a suitable noblewoman, but as the perfect genetic match. She united the Windsor line with a reservoir of preserved royal DNA that stretched back further and in some ways ran purer than the Windsors themselves. In William and Harry, this strategy bore fruit. William, with his commanding height, classical features, and natural air of kingship, embodies the best of both Windsor and Spencer inheritance, an heir whose blood is both ancient and adaptable to the needs of the modern crown. Harry, meanwhile, carries forward the warrior streak that the Spencers deliberately cultivated, a legacy of independence and military service stretching back centuries. In different ways, both sons demonstrate the versatility the Spencers had preserved for generations. The world mourned Diana after her tragic death not only because of her warmth and compassion, but also, perhaps unconsciously, because something deeper was lost. She was not merely the people's princess. She was the living vessel of centuries of carefully preserved lineage, a bridge between past monarchies and the future of the crown. In her passing, the Spencers' long-guarded genetic treasury was left to survive only through her sons. Her absence became more than personal grief. It was the silencing of a dynastic strategy that had shaped history in ways few could see. And yet, through William and Harry, the legacy endures. a living reminder that behind the romance of royalty lies a science as deliberate as any empire, with Diana as its most luminous creation.